All right. Well, welcome back to this ad hoc podcast that we're calling Database School, where I get to talk to people who are database geniuses. So no pressure, Stephen, and learn a bunch of stuff. So today, I'm here with my friend Stephen Margheim, and I know him from Twitter. I've been following him for a while, and the reason that I know you is you are the Rails SQLite guru, and so you started popping up everywhere. I don't know when you got into it. I'll be curious to hear that story, but I have read, I think, everything you've written about Rails and SQLite, and I've never written a line of Rails in my life, but it's very instructive and very helpful for me, especially as, Rails and Laravel are quite similar. So reading a lot of your stuff has been incredibly helpful. So, with that introduction, welcome, Stephen. I'm glad we finally get to hang out.
Yes, thank you. Me too.
So you are, we were just talking, you are an American living in Germany doing Rails work and have been big into SQLite. So can you tell me a little bit, just here at the beginning, a little bit about how you ended up where you are? You came from a non-traditional path, kind of like I did. So tell me how you got into Rails and how you ended up in Germany.
Yeah, so I am not a software developer by trade in the sense of getting a degree at university in computer science. I was a classicist. I studied Greek and Latin literature and philosophy. And I was in a graduate program in Philadelphia, and I actually got my first laptop as a graduate student. I had worked in undergrad at the computer lab. It just bounced around and did everything in the cloud. And so I sort of felt this obligation to use this expensive new tool to its fullest. So I started reading all of these different blogs from academics who had a bent towards building tools and using tools and sort of building out workflows. And just got really into it. And the sort of natural progression, you download a script from somebody's blog. I started off with a lot of AppleScript. And you're like, this is interesting. I wonder if I could just change this 10%. And you open it up.
That's how they get you.
This is kind of readable. Let me just, how much Googling does it take? Of course, at the time, no AI, had to Google everything like an animal. And you get the computer to do that. Like, wow, computers can do that. I wonder if I could get this 10%. And over the course of 3 years, I just went deeper and deeper and deeper into the rabbit hole until I eventually realized that I was spending way more
Hey, I
time
hope you're enjoying this.
building
Just as a
software to be
reminder,
good
you
academic
can
than I
learn
was
more
using
about
the software and
SQLite at
being a good academic. So I finally
highperformance.seqlite.com.
decided
I'll get out of your way.
to
Back to the
leave
interview.
academia and get a job. And the job I got happened to be a Rails shop. I didn't know any Rails, had not done any web programming. So I learned Rails, learned about the web and building for the web, and just fell in love with all of it. And for my second job, I sort of realized I was 28. This was the first job opportunity I had where I wasn't basically begging. I had some experience and some expertise, and I recognized wow, this is basically the complete opposite job market from academia because I actually have some optionality. And I thought, I'm 28, I'm single, I don't have a ton of stuff. I probably could literally live anywhere in the world and have a job and support myself. And I thought I kind of had an obligation to my future self to at least give myself the chance to do something bold and interesting. So I'm 9 generations removed from a German immigrant. So I literally went on a job board and I filtered for Rails and I filtered for Germany. I applied to some jobs. I got lucky enough to get a job and they were willing to pay to relocate me. And I've been in Germany for the last almost 6 years.
Wow, that's wild. Like I hinted, I came from an accounting background, and we actually we went to school just down the road from each other. So there would have been a time. I went to Texas A&M. I've learned you went to Baylor. So there would have been a time when we were bitter rivals. Thankfully, that is all behind us now that we're grown adults. But
Yes.
so
For the
it's
most
funny
part, yes, it is.
for the
Completely
most
behind
part,
me.
great. I can't wait to get into it. So yeah, very similar backgrounds. Except I did not move to Germany. I have been in Texas my entire life, so you've got one up on me there. And so, how did you go from how did you pick up Rails coming from I'm an academic tinkering with AppleScript to I'm a professional enough Rails developer to get a job? Hey, I hope you're enjoying this. Just as a reminder, you can learn more about SQLite at highperformancesqlite.com. I'll get out of your way. Back to the interview.
Well, I got lucky is the short answer. I It took me a while. I had to apply to a lot of places and had a lot of conversations until I found a team whose hiring process was oriented more around show us what you can do and talk with us about how you're doing it and how you're thinking, more so than it was give us a paper trail to make us feel
Nice.
safe and confident that we can just hire you. And so I was able to demonstrate that I could think clearly and could articulate my thoughts clearly in a way that, and it was just for a junior programmer role that they were willing to give me a chance. And my first week, they sat me down and said, "Here is a tutorial, online, free tutorial to learn Rails. Your first week is to go through this." So I had not seen or heard anything about Ruby, seen or heard
Good
anything
for
about Rails,
them.
and they trained me, and I am incredibly lucky and appreciative. That was the internal sort of consulting team for Penn Medicine. So the whole medical complex, the medical school and the hospitals, they have an internal IT team that does various things, and one portion of that team builds web applications that are back office tools for various different teams and departments throughout the medical complex. And they gave me a chance and they taught me Rails.
That good for them. That is incredible. And I will get to SQLite in a second, but I can't imagine. I don't know very much. Let me rephrase. I don't know anything about academia, but I can imagine coming out of academia and having the job qualification not be a paper trail and not be a line of people that are saying this person is smart. It's more show me what you can do. I imagine that was a massive shock based on the water you had been swimming in, huh?
Yeah, it was quite different. In certain ways, similar. In other ways, though, like I was mostly studying these dead languages, right? So no speaking, just reading and writing, and so a lot of what I was doing was how do I take the way that I naturally think, which is in English and thoroughly in that culture, but like sort of stretch and adapt my brain to be able to conceive of thoughts in different languages. And there are some sort of low level thought pattern similarities to like having to read Latin, like reading Ruby or C or PHP or what have you.
That's fascinating. Not something my brain has ever experienced because I don't, speak or read any other languages, but I can imagine the interesting and kind of fun like corollaries between learning a language and learning a language. It's kind of they're
Yeah.
kind of the same. That's interesting. Okay, so you got into Rails, and now fast forward to today. You're Rails SQLite guy. Like, if anybody in the Rails community is like, "Oh, what's the deal with SQLite?" They're like, "I don't know. Just ask Stephen." So, how did you like? Where did this come from? This line of your career, because you've gotten stuff like you've gotten some pretty core stuff in Rails itself changed to support SQLite better, which I want to talk about. But where did the original interest in SQLite come from?
Yeah. So the job that I moved to Germany for, I eventually became the engineering manager for that department. And over a few years, the nature of that role shifted and evolved, like to a place where, and I still love programming. I wanted to still be doing programming. So I became sort of the frontmost person in our R&D department. So I would take opportunities to build new applications. Oftentimes they were, for like individual customers who had very specific needs, or we wanted to just sort of dip a toe in the water of a new business vertical and see like how the market reacted. And pretty quickly, I came to realize that I was under a unique set of constraints. Right? I was in meetings almost all day, just the nature of the role. And so aside from like being able to spin up an application, like create something from nothing quickly, and Rails is good at that. And when you know how to use the tool well, like you can do that quickly. But when you are actually running it in production, you have to maintain it. And so whether that's fixing bugs or like adding a small feature, I had these small requirements, but I just did not have a lot of time. And so I eventually came to realize that like really the constraint I had was I need to be able to have someone tell me what they need and 30 minutes later have that delivered. And that's just like an incredibly fast turnaround time.
That is.
And as I iterated through various things, I just started off using Heroku and sending stuff up. And I realized that every single indirection, every single dependency, every single additional component in the overall system added time to me going from you need this to I'm giving this to you. And so I just was stripping and stripping and stripping away. And I after maybe 2 applications I had like built, I just decided to try using the defaults. Like if you just run Rails new in your terminal, it'll use SQLite. And I knew a lot about SQLite from my old sort of building tools as an academic. That's the database that you use. And I had worked with other applications whose data was stored in SQLite and all of that. So I felt comfortable with it. And really quickly, I recognized, okay, the operational simplicity that this gives me actually makes it possible for me to do 30-minute turnarounds. Pardon me. So I fell in love with that reality. And especially when you contrast that with the sort of standard situation when you're working in an app for a company that's been around for 10 years and has had, 100 different programmers touch it. You can barely even understand what's happening in one controller in 30 minutes. And it honestly was addictive, that experience of like, I can keep the entire system in my head. I can work with this system. I understand everything. Like there really are only 2 tools. Like there's just Rails and there's just SQLite. And if I can master those tools, I have an incredible amount of leverage available to me, and I can really build anything I need and without swimming in so much complexity that it's just impossible for me to have these kinds of quick turnarounds between calls. So that's how I stumbled into it. And then as these things go, like you fall in love with that part of the experience. And so as you start bumping into problems, you're like, well, I don't want to give up on this. So I'm willing to go through the pain to fix these problems so that I can keep this one thing I really love, which is this operational simplicity and sort of the simplicity of the mental model in the system. And so I found myself ready and willing to start doing work to smooth the rough edges I started bumping into.
So you mentioned, you said simplicity, complexity, and operations. You said those 3 words a bunch of times. And so in your role, it was more about operational simplicity and reducing the complexity of running the app. And so when you had that limited time constraint, SQLite pushed you to be able to do more things because it was easier to deploy. You don't have to keep a database server running. You don't have to put the database server somewhere. And so that was allowing you to, is that conceptual compression? DHH always talks about that. Is that a flavor of that, or is that something different?
Yeah, I think it is. So for me, it was two kinds of simplicity. And the big one was operational simplicity, to say, I only need to worry about one machine.
Yeah.
I only need to worry about two dependencies on that machine, right? Can I get Ruby installed on that machine, and can I get SQLite installed on that machine? And then when, like you have this mental model in your head of like, what is this application doing? What are all of the routes? How do they relate? What is going on there? Like, I only need to understand these two things, right? There's not like, well, how exactly does Redis work? And I'm using this Redis server with these configuration variables for caching, but this other Redis server with these other configuration variables for background jobs. But I'm using, this MySQL database for Active Record. And so for this one code path where I'm saving these 3 rows to the database and then kicking off a background job, which I guess is going to be there because I'm sending an email, and then I'm caching this view, it's hard to keep all of that in your head. And when everything is it's just SQL, it's just SQLite. There are files on the disk, there are these pieces of software I need to have running, and I can take a reasonable amount of time and master them. Like, you've done it, right? Like, you can actually just read all of the valuable docs on SQLite. It takes a couple afternoons. So that simplicity was massive. And then that ties into the sort of simplicity of the system, right? It's like, I actually can keep a mental model of what this application is and how it works, like, in my head. And so when I haven't looked at it for 3 weeks, and then I get a Slack message and like, oop, here's a bug I just bumped into, I can get back into flow inside of 10 minutes and then fix the bug in 10 minutes and deploy the fix in 10 minutes. Whereas, like, when you're dealing with these larger setups that are coordinating these 6 different tools, if you happen to be trying to fix a bug in a code path that touches 5 of those tools, like, you have to just get all of that back into your head. Like, right, how do we configure Redis for background jobs? Does that matter? Is this a part of the bug? So that kind of simplicity was it was a completely different experience when you have, like, those actual requirements. Like, I got the Slack message and I have this call in 30 minutes and it's a show-stopping bug. How do I make this work? And I could not find any setup that, at least for me, allowed me to do that until I just went all in on SQLite and said, if I have any kind of persistent data need, I'm working with a SQLite database file.
So I like a few things about that, and then I have a follow-up question. One of the things I think I like the most about this is there is in the zeitgeist, basically we only speak in absolutes, and what you're saying runs completely counter to all of that, saying, here was my situation, here was the way that here are the constraints that I, Stephen, had. Here's the way that my brain works. And I solved all of those constraints together. And it turns out vanilla Rails with vanilla SQLite was the answer for this set of constraints, which includes your own preferences and your own tastes. And so I just want to say that I very much appreciate that. The point of view that's like, what is my reality and how can I solve it? Instead of saying, no, SQLite and Rails is the only way you should ever do anything. You never said that. I don't know if you believe that, but you never said it. I don't think that's true, but I think what you have done is say, this is a great solution for where I'm at. And I really appreciate that. And then you can address that, or the follow-up question comment is, before we get into more of like the nitty-gritty SQLite details, does your point of view on simplicity and operational simplicity extend to other areas? Like, obviously you and I are going to talk a lot about the database, but is this a point of view that you hold kind of across the fullness of the stack and maybe the fullness of products or your life or the whole thing? But where do you stand on maybe operational simplicity as like a philosophy, or where do you stand on operational simplicity as compared to where the industry is going? So whichever route you want to take.
Yeah, well, my answer to that question ties into your first statement as well, because I agree with you that the tenor of conversation that tends towards absolutes is harmful to thinking well and thinking clearly about problems. And so I am actually fairly passionate and dogmatic about the philosophy that you should try to build something as simply as possible. And that applies to every single layer of the stack, to every single aspect of the problem. You should try, like, how far can I get with just forms, with just get and post requests, with just HTML native elements, with just redirects? Like, how far can I get with that? Can I actually, like, let's challenge ourselves to build modern, beautiful, interactive experiences with just those tools. And let's, like, how many features and how many users can you serve on a single machine? Like, do you have to have a coordinated fleet of machines? Like, I've got my one machine with my load balancer, and it's talking to my 3 different machines with my application process on it. And I've got my one machine for my background jobs, and it has its backup. And I have my other machine for the cache, and it has its backup. And I have my 3 different machines that are physically separate to present a logically consistent database, and it has its backups, and all of that is network and coordinated. Is that necessary on day 0? Like, is that what we're presenting to people coming into web development? Yeah, come on in, the water's warm. All you have to do is learn everything about everything on day 0. All you have to do is understand, like, web application firewalls and port forwarding and how to have public and private connections between machines and why we would even do all. It's like, no, like, what can we do with less? And I think it's valuable both, like, for us as an industry, right? Like, to have a path for beginners, to have, like, a graduation of complexity over time as your needs change and evolve and grow. But I think it's also really valuable for us as individuals, as, like, practitioners and craftspeople, to remind ourselves that there is this temptation. I have felt it regularly, right? To be like, I want to make the right choice. And it's so easy for the thought there to be, well, the right choice is the choice that allows me to do what I need to do today. And if I change nothing, will allow me to do what I think will be the case in 1 week. And if I change nothing, it will allow me to do the thing that I think will be the case in 1 month and 1 year and 5 years. And we, like, presume this series of, like, escalating complexity and escalating needs, and, like, I should choose on day 0 something that will work on year 5. Mm-hmm. And it's like, we have no idea what's going to happen on year 5. And why, if you want to give yourself the best chance of surviving until year 5, like, build a system that you can manage in 30-minute increments because it's so fast and so simple and so lean that it actually is in your head. That's going to give you your best chance to being at year 5 and then, like, crossing that bridge. But I think it's so easy for us to get stuck on, like, well, the right thing to do is to, like, it's day 0, I'm trying to bootstrap my little app. I should use Vitess. If it's good enough for YouTube, it's good enough for me. It's like, you don't have YouTube's problems. No. You're not ingesting terabytes of data every 10 seconds. So do you have to take on all of that complexity? So that is a deep part of my philosophy that is fed by my interest in SQLite, and also in meaningful ways originates from my work with SQLite and Rails.
So if I am hearing correctly, I think I heard a few reasons why this philosophy is dear to you. One being, it's easier to onboard people. It's easier to onboard people into a particular project, but also onboard people into the industry itself. And that was something that DHH said in the interview with him about SQLite was people are going to give up. But the fewer reasons or the fewer blockers we put in their way, the fewer people are going to give up. And so if starting with Rails new spins up a SQLite file, and then you can keep going and you don't have to stop to figure out what is Postgres, what is MySQL, is it running, how do I connect to it? Then more people are going to get further down the road. So it sounds like that is one of your reasons, but I think at a baser level, it sounds like maybe the root reason is you believe simplicity is inherently good and there's really nothing below that. Like it from that springs a lot of reasons. Like it's easier to onboard, it's easier to come back to, it's easier to put the whole app in your brain, it's easier to pick a thing and move forward and fix it later. Those all spring from a base reality of simple is better than complex. Is that right?
Yeah, it is right, and I honestly have this somewhat like geometric image in my head, like always, like from when I was a kid. Like when I think about problems, they have a kind of geometry to them, and it's like the solution needs to fit the problem, right? Like I'm trying to remember this, famous video of like a child putting blocks into this little toy, and there's like the star hole and the square hole and the circle hole and the triangle hole, and they're just putting everything into the square hole, and it just doesn't feel right. It's like the star should go in the star hole and the square should go in the square hole. And even if you can rotate the triangle and fit it into the square hole, it's not where it's supposed to go. And so if a problem only needs these things, like that's all that I should apply to it. And it is just like a aesthetic requirement in my bones.
Yeah, it sounds so like so visceral. Like I was gonna say, why is simple better than complex? But we're at the bottom. Like we're at the core. We're in your gut, and it just is. Like it just feels correct. And I mean, I feel that exact same thing. It's like there's a sense of satisfaction when it clicks, and you're like, "Yep, that's the right thing." And usually that is like what is the simplest way forward. And so, yeah, I very much appreciate and vibe with all of that. So you're at the spot where you're pushing SQLite vanilla Rails as far as it can go, and you start bumping into rough edges. So tell me about your journey from I'm using it out of the box to I am changing what's in the box so that other people have a better first run experience. How did that journey, including and up to now, you write a lot. So how did that progress?
Yeah. So if anyone was trying to run vanilla SQLite and vanilla Rails application 2 years ago, they are 100% going to have experienced the same pain points I did. And the biggest, most prevalent one is that you're just going to start seeing database locked errors in your logs. And you'll be using the application and like you don't see all these massive problems, but like you look at your logs and they're just like streaming. So it started there, and I wanted to understand like what is happening. Like it's a problem. It definitely looks like a problem in my logs. It says error and it looks scary. I don't see a lot of degradation in the experience, so I'm a little bit confused what's going on here. So I dug into that and learned a lot of different things. We can get into those details. And as I went, this was my phase of like reading more of the docs. And I just started bumping into these things more and more, where the pattern was always the same. There's a feature that is available in Rails for working with databases. So a great example here is like defining generated columns.
Love generated columns. Talk to me about generated columns.
They're beautiful.
Baby.
I love them too. And I remember when that feature was released in Rails and all of the documentation for Postgres, I was like, that is cool. I just like that. And not available for SQLite. Okay, that's fine. I'm just like reading the docs because I'm trying to figure out like how does SQLite work? Like what are these database locked errors? Like let me just master this tool a little bit more. And I just bump into SQLite does generated columns. Oh, it's done it for like a decade. Like this is an old feature.
Yeah.
Why can't I do that in Rails? And then I bump into another thing. Like here's a feature. Rails has it, but Rails with SQLite doesn't have it, but SQLite has it. So Rails has it, SQLite has it, but when you put them together, for some reason, it's not there. So this is another one, just sort of like aesthetics. This is just ridiculous, all the code, all the hard work other smart people have done. It just seems that no one has cared enough to take the time to tie the knots. So I started bumping into, there was like a handful of them, maybe 4, maybe 5. And I was like, I'm literally just copying and pasting code with minor tweaks. This is good work for AI, but it wasn't popular at the time. So I started opening those pull requests and digging more into like where are these database locked errors coming from and what's really going on there. And that was a longer investigation to really understand everything that was happening there, which we can get into. And that energy and that activity just happened to, in some ways, I guess, coincide with this growing feeling that I had that I wanted to revive my blog. I'd been quite active writing when I was in academia and sort of contributing back to here's how I'm using technology to be a better academic. And it sort of died down as I transitioned out, and I couldn't even get it running again years later. Like all the tools didn't even work on my new machine. Yep.
Talk about simplicity. That's a classic. My static site generator doesn't run anymore.
Exactly. And so I'll just be 100% honest with you. No cap, as they say.
As people not our age might say, yes.
Yeah,
much younger.
but I'm super hip.
You're very cool. I agree.
Yeah, but you honestly did play a large role in helping me to like just get over that hump and say like this is something I want to do. It's something that I enjoy doing. It makes me feel better, right? To just like I receive a lot of value from people writing and creating videos and doing podcasts, and it has transformed my life, my ability to get into tech and to find this thing that I really love and that I have some capacity for. And I do feel a kind of moral obligation to pay that back. And yeah, it was around the time of your Laracon Somewhere talk, right? Of like, make your own luck. Like you just gotta do it. Do the work, like do work and then tell people about it. So it was just a perfect storm. It's like I'm doing this work, I'm investigating these things, bumping into some stuff. I see a route forward to get more involved in Rails core. And I was having this general low-level feeling like I want to start writing more and I want to build a blog again. And then you just put it over the top. It's like, I resonated with a lot of what you said in that talk. I was like, okay, I'm just going to do it. I took a couple afternoons, just got a basic blog up and running. And I was just following your script. And I said, okay, here's the task. I am going to publish something every day for the next week. So what am I doing? And I had the first two. My very first post, I had bumped into and then like explored. I want to do database branching the way that Planet Scale hypes it up. I hope I'm allowed to use the word.
You are. We'll bleep it out, but you're allowed to use it. No, I'm just kidding.
But it was... So I found like, hey, I actually like doing branching with SQLite much better because I can bind my Git branch and my database branch together because it's just a file. And it turned out that it was quite easy to wire things together with Rails to like get this behavior where every time you have a new branch, you can spin up a new database and you can have it seeded and ready to go from the jump. So like I had that first post. And then, like, where am I going to go? And so over the course of that week, everything kicked off. And then you start having conversations with folks, and those lead to more things. And I eventually had a video call with the maintainer of the SQLite gem for Ruby, who I later found out was the manager of the Shopify team that employs many of the Rails core contributors. And so when I was sharing with him my thoughts around like, hey, like there's this feature in SQLite and in Rails, but not in the SQLite adapter in Rails, and there's this one and there's this one and there's this one. He was like, yeah, you should totally do that. Let me know when you open those pull requests and I will ping people to actually look at them. And this is like the big hurdle. There's just too many pull requests.
Yeah.
You know, Rails has like basically never had less than 400 open, I think. And so, that first week of really pushing hard, I just stumbled into some useful connections and people actually looked at my pull requests. And then once you have a couple merged and you have a little bit of like credibility, it's easier. People will look at the next ones and stuff. And so, from there, it just sort of flowed. And now I've gotten maybe 13 or 14 changes into Rails, commits into Rails. And the story for SQLite is massively different and massively better. Like it is my personal goal. I love Laravel and I love the community, but I want Rails to be the world's best web framework for running SQLite-backed web applications. And I feel confident that we are presently in the lead.
That's great. And listen, I love Laravel, but I have nothing but respect for Rails, and I think that is a noble goal, and you should pursue it at all costs. Well, you should pursue it as much as you want. I didn't know any of that, and I'm very honored that I played some small part in reviving the writing era of Stephen. That makes me really happy. So I'm honored, and thank you for telling me. And this I need to start writing these case studies down, because it was very easy. If people weren't listening closely, they might have missed. You decided to write for 1 week and it changed your life. Like within 1 week, you're on the phone with the big boss inside of Shopify, the big Rails person inside of Shopify, and you're like, you have an inside track. And it was 1 week. And obviously that's not going to happen for everybody, but it happened for you. And that was as a result of, I think it's interesting because it's like, I'm already doing the work. And that's the hard part, right? Doing the work is the hard part. But then the emotional hard part is I'm going to tell everybody about it. And 1 week into that, you're on the inside track into getting PRs landed in Rails. And that just makes me so happy. I'm so thrilled to hear that was your experience. Yeah.
And I mean, I'm thrilled to be chatting with you about it, but it genuinely did happen just like that. And also, I think the other important takeaway, like as I look back on it, is that I didn't have a week's worth of content ready when I started. It was also like, and I think that the other part of it, and this was something that I learned from you and that you talked about, and I do think it is important, is that consistency helps a lot. Like you build up momentum. Like you can take velocity, but you can also get acceleration, and you get acceleration through consistency. And so, the very first blog post that I wrote, and I tweet about it and I pushed out, and I have some followers, but not like many, and a bit of something. But about like on day 5, right? Like it's just getting shared, and like more people are hearing about it. And I'm very, very confident that a large part of that was just through the consistency of like, by day 5, people are like, this guy is like, I guess he's the SQLite guy, right? He's just talking about it a lot. So you don't have to have it all figured out at the beginning, but consistency is an underrated point of leverage. It just helps a lot. And, but then, increase your surface area for luck, and you can get lucky.
You can, and it's interesting that you can almost brute force your way into being the guy of something. Like if you just write about Rails and SQLite enough, people are like, yeah, he's the Rails SQLite guy. Oh, I'm in the Rails world and I have a SQLite question. Where's that Rails SQLite guy? What's his name again? And it's just you. And that is like that is an underrated or under discussed reality of at least our industry, maybe the world, is you can just do the thing enough and people will associate you with that thing, and then you become the person who is like inextricably linked with the thing. And I think the false notion that people have is that there's a cabal somewhere that that promotes or nominates a person to be the person of something, and it's like, no, it's just kind of, it's all organic, and once you talk about something enough, people associate with you, and then there's no stopping it. Then it's a runaway train, because everybody is continually piling on that, yes, Stephen is the Rails SQLite guy. And I think that is under discussed and strategically exploitable, not in a bad way, but like you can take advantage of that strategically if you want to be the something. Like if you want to be the person of something, you can just do that yourself, and I think that's pretty exciting. Okay, I want to talk about some of the nitty gritty gory details that you discovered, because you wrote this really interesting, in my opinion, really interesting Backoff thing instead of the straight busy timeout. You discovered that the Ruby, you'll have to forgive me on some of the specific, the Ruby or Rails blocker was blocking, or the wait, the original SQLite wait was blocking, and so that just kind of hosed everybody and everything. And then you have a couple of blessed or suggested pragmas that you discovered work best with Rails. So any gory detail you want to talk about, the audience is technical, so don't be shy, but tell us some of those things you discovered and where you fixed them, whether that's in Rails or this SQLite gem that you mentioned or somewhere else. Talk us through that.
Yeah, so we'll start with one of the earliest contributions, which were around the initial pragmas that you set up when you initiate a connection to SQLite. So Rails already had a layer in its stack. So whenever it would spin up a new connection to put into its connection pool, it would turn on foreign keys. So it would run that pragma. And so every connection, foreign keys are turned on. And if anyone goes and Googles, like what are the recommended pragmas for SQLite, you'll find a very consistent overlap of 6 or 7 pragmas. So the very biggest one, and you talk about this in your course, right, is that like getting into wall journaling mode out of the default rollback journal gives you concurrent reads. It's going to open up your performance characteristics a lot, especially for the kinds of applications that are common in Rails and Laravel, which are CRUD-centric applications. So those tend to have a power distribution between reads and writes. 80% of your operations are going to be reads. Then you can, when you're in wall mode, it's a safer sort of risk trade-off to downgrade your synchronous pragma so that you're not flushing to disk after every single operation, which is one of the most expensive operations that SQLite does. So that's just going to give you more performance headroom. And then increasing the size of your memory cache. Like this is another thing that I think it's easy for people to not register, right? Like, Redis, it's so fast. It does everything in memory. It's like every single database in the world does most of its work in memory. The disk is there as the persistent backup. It's just it's going to eventually get there. But most databases want to do as much as possible with data that it keeps in memory. And with SQLite, you can configure how big of a block of memory does it have to hold data. And especially again, if you're coming from this mindset of what am I doing on day 0 when I'm just starting an application up, you can get incredibly far with your entire database living in memory. You can have the speed of Redis with SQLite. And I actually had a DM from a guy. It was like, hey, we're trying this experiment out of replacing Redis with SQLite for this particular application. And we're running these benchmarks. And SQLite is faster than Redis, but we're getting the full power of SQL. So I know I set something up wrong. Can you help me figure out what I did wrong? And we look at
make it slower.
it's like, I must be, where's my bug? And we look at it and I'm like, no. You see, your data is smaller than the memory range. SQLite's doing everything in memory, and it's just better tuned for the operations you're asking it to do than Redis is for that in-memory work. So there's that. There are a few others. So that one was easy. Like, I didn't have to introduce a new sort of like concept or layer of abstraction into Rails. It was just in that place. Instead of running one pragma, run 7. And that was an immediate improvement.
Is that the first one you landed?
That was the first notable one. The very first one I landed was allowing for the pipe concat operator in default functions. So Rails has an allow list of the functions you can use when you're defining, or the operators and method SQL functions you can use when you're defining a default function. And the pipes weren't in there, and SQLite doesn't have like the concat all caps function. So that was my very, very first one. And then the new set of pragmas was the second. But the really gnarly change was around these database locked errors. And it took me a while to really track down like what was going on. So I'm going to try my best to explain it,
Yeah, take us
because
there.
it's deeply connected to the way that Ruby works. So Ruby, like other programming languages, Python is the same way, can be multi-threaded, right? You can spin up multiple different threads that are executing Ruby code. Ruby is an interpreted language. But the way that it is architected, and this is true of many of these interpreted languages, created in the 80s and 90s, it only allows for one, let's call it execution context of Ruby, to be running at a time. So it has what it calls a global virtual machine lock or a global interpreter lock. So at the Ruby level, like the C code that is executing your Ruby code, it bottlenecks everything down to we can only have concurrency, not parallelism, right? So you can spin up multiple threads, and they will coordinate on like, hey, I want to go. Okay, you get to go. You can run some Ruby. You take a break. Now you come in. You can run some Ruby. You take a break. And this, concurrency works great. Like, you don't need parallelism to get fast performance. And for web applications, it works pretty well because you necessarily have a mix of I/O. So you have a web request come in, and you need to run some Ruby to like parse that text blob that came in and generate like a request object, and then pass it through your router and do things. And then as it gets into Rails, you're going to need to do some CPU work. You're going to need to talk to a database. You're going to go and make some other third-party HTTP requests. So when your thread that is processing that particular web request is making a third-party HTTP request, the Ruby interpreter is like, cool, you're hanging out, you're doing external I/O, I'm going to let this other thread run. And then that thread will be, I'm going to pick up a new request. And so you've got like this standard image of concurrency that you've seen, where you got these 3 different threads running, and they're able to do different kinds of I/O in parallel, but you're only able to do Ruby sequentially. So when you're working with most databases, like, everything's great, because when you make a call to MySQL, you make a call to Postgres, whether it's on another machine or on the same machine, it's in a different process. So it is definitionally external I/O. That's how the computer sees it. You don't have to do anything for Ruby to see that's different I/O. And so I'm just going to do some other Ruby. SQLite is great. And one of the things that makes it great is that it isn't an external process. You don't have the overhead of inter-process communication. It's embedded into your process of the web application. And typically, this is a really great speed boost. Like, just that inter-process communication is like can be about a 10x difference in performance. But in the context of Ruby, what that means is that the Ruby interpreter, when you are talking to SQLite, and SQLite is running. Like SQLite's C code is being executed. The Ruby interpreter doesn't think that that's external I/O. It thinks, I have to keep running this Ruby thread. And so no other Ruby threads are able to run any Ruby. So you can't pick up and start processing another web request. And so it bottlenecks your performance. You've got this multi-threaded web application. You're supposed to be able to be processing 5 requests concurrently, and you can't. And so that's like,
So let me
core
say it back
situation.
to you.
Yeah.
We'll see if I got it. Let me say it back. So Ruby is concurrent, and so typically it's just bouncing back and forth between 3, 4, 5, 6, as many concurrent processes as are running. As a process reaches out to some third party, I guess you said the C code looks at that and says, all right, we're waiting on somebody else. Let's pick up another Ruby thread and do some work. And then we'll come back to this guy when it's done reading off the disk or waiting for the API or whatever. That works great, very elegant, very fast. Because of the way that Postgres and MySQL exist, which is over a network, that is by default external. And so Ruby looks at that and says, great, external request, we'll see you in a little bit, I'm going to go do some other work. However, with SQLite, it is not by default an external request. And so if you hit SQLite and it says, I'm busy, let's wait for 5 seconds, Ruby says, okay, I'm still working, and nobody else can do any work because I'm still working with this SQLite thing that is not external. Is that right?
Right.
Okay.
So by default, from the point of view of the Ruby
problem.
interpreter, it sees the SQLite work as Ruby work, and so it doesn't switch out to another concurrent thread to process web requests. And so, you took the next step to the core problem, which is, so you set up, basically all web application frameworks these days will set up timeouts for database connections. Say, hey, if I reach out to the database and it doesn't respond in 5 seconds, like just cancel, and typically that's a configuration that you set on the database. So you tell the database just quit after 5 seconds. That's the default in Rails, 5 seconds, whatever you set it to. And so we have this one situation, the way that Ruby deals with concurrency and can only have one Ruby thread executing Ruby at a time. Then you have the other sort of bottlenecking situation, which is on SQLite's level, right? And SQLite only supports sequential writes. So when you're in wall mode, sure, you can have concurrent reads. You can send 5 different connections at SQLite and have them run 5 completely different select statements, and SQLite will serve them in parallel, those 5 different connections. But if you're doing an update or an insert, it won't. It has to line those up and say, I'll do this update, and then once it's done, I'll do this insert. And so this bottleneck, the way that SQLite provides some control to you as a developer is to say, how long are you willing to let a write operation wait before it runs? And so when you set a timeout in Rails, that is what you are setting. That's the configuration that you're actually doing in SQLite. And what SQLite will do is it has this basic implementation, and it's in SQLite C code that's going to do it's not quite exponential backoff, but it will check in 1 millisecond, and then 2 milliseconds, then 3 milliseconds, then 5, and then 10, and then 10, and then 10, and then 25. And to say, hey, am I able to do a write? Like, can I acquire the write lock? That's how SQLite manages these things. And it's going to run through those. And so what happened is that when you put these two things together, a Ruby thread is processing a web request. It gets into the Rails application. The Rails application makes a call. It's like, post.create. That gets converted by all the Rails code into a command to SQLite to run an insert. And that Ruby thread sends that command to SQLite. embedded inside that same process. And there is some other web request, some other connection to the database that is currently working on that database. And your current request is not able to make that right. And so it just enters into SQLite's Backoff. It's like, okay, I'll hang out, I'll check back. And while it's doing that, Ruby thinks Ruby stuff is still happening. And so Ruby doesn't switch out. And so the combination of these two things basically mean that you go from a multi-threaded web application to a single-threaded web application as soon as you have two that hit. And so this was one of the core problems. There's two core problems. This is the first and gnarliest, sort of this combination of the place where Ruby bottlenecks and the place where SQLite bottlenecks, and the nature of how they connect will completely bottleneck your entire application. And so you would look at it and you would see two things. One, it would be incredibly slow. Right? You run basic benchmarks and your request per second would look odd. Like, I thought SQLite was the fast database. And then the second thing you would see is you would start to see randomly these database locked errors, because if you had, so especially when you're running benchmarks and you're sending a lot of requests concurrently, there would always be the unlucky ones, like the very worst ones, who are at the end of the line. And at the very end of the queue, they don't get to the front of the queue within the timeout period, and they would throw. But like when you're running the application in production and you don't have like you don't actually have that much concurrent load, right, you very rarely see it. So you have that core problem. I'll pause there before we talk about the second problem and the solutions.
Yes. Okay. So this makes perfect sense to me. Knowing what I know about SQLite and learning what I have now learned about Ruby, this makes sense to me why this would be a kind of like a funny coincidence of errors here, because the way that they work together creates a pretty huge problem. And it's interesting that by its nature, SQLite kind of worked backwards up the stack to make Rails single-threaded or Ruby single-threaded based on its nature. And that is, it feels very funny that it's poisoned the whole stack because of one technical implementation. And so I'm interested. I think I know where this is helpful for me, because I've read all your writing about this stuff and didn't quite, like, not knowing Ruby and Rails, didn't quite grasp the severity of it. And now this makes perfect sense. So let's hear either the solution or the second gnarly problem, because I'm curious what could be more gnarly than that.
Yeah. So the solution to this problem is that we have to stop using SQLite's Backoff implementation, because there's no way, I can't change that code. So I can't tell it, instead of like using OS level sleeps, I need you to use a sleep that Ruby is aware of, so that Ruby sees, you're sleeping, you're just idling. And so luckily,
because tell me the default implementation in SQLite, that is something that Ruby can't see as idle. Is that right? Right.
So when it calls, it's basically sleeping for different durations of milliseconds, but it's just at the lowest level. So it's calling your operating system sleep. And Ruby has a Ruby sleep, which basically says, like, A, I will tell the operating system to sleep, but B, because I'm Ruby and I am single execution context, I will flag, hey, this thread is idling, allow another thread to start running interpreted Ruby.
Got it. Okay.
So it has that side effect. But SQLite has the two levels. You can use their default implementation of how to handle a situation where a connection is busy, or you can write your own. And the Ruby driver for SQLite exposes that interface. And so we wrote a Ruby implementation of a Backoff. And instead of, and we call sleep from the Ruby programming language, and sleep in the Ruby programming language tells Ruby the interpreter, hey, oh, this is like I'm idling. Another thread can now come in and execute. So
So
that
in
was all it really took. Once I understood what was actually happening, and that took a long time, the solution was relatively straightforward.
so SQLite exposes several different ways you can customize it, like a whole lot of different ways. And uh, I've never done it because I have never needed to do it. So the one that I think you were hooking into is the busy handler. Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, so you're hooking into the busy handler. The SQLite gem, the Ruby SQLite gem, already had a hook into the SQL or the busy handler. Is that right?
Yes.
And then what are you writing? Because from my understanding, those hooks, you're writing the C code that modifies like SQLite itself. So are you writing C code that is somehow Ruby flags that sleep process, or how? What is
Right.
the actual detail there?
So I did not have to write C code for this solution. The SQLite gem in Ruby is the driver. And what that means is that it has a bunch of C code which uses SQLite's C APIs and uses Ruby's C APIs to tell the two how to talk. And so it allows me to write Ruby and drive SQLite's C APIs. And so somebody has to write the code to bind them together. So it had already been done that somebody wrote the C code that exposed SQLite's busy handler C public function, exposed it through Ruby, and allows me using the gem to have a Ruby object that represents the SQLite database and to define a block of Ruby code that will be executed when SQLite calls the busy handler. So SQLite calls the busy handler itself internally in C. The Ruby SQLite driver has C code that says, hey, I've registered a busy handler. So SQLite calls the driver's C code, and that C code says, I'm now going to execute some user-defined Ruby. And it executes that Ruby-defined Ruby, and then once it's done, it tells the SQLite C code in the Ruby driver C code, the user-defined Ruby code is now done, and that's like how it flows. So it had to
That
do that.
is pretty awesome.
Yeah. And I actually have now become a bit of a C programmer because I've contributed a few improvements to the SQLite gem, which are just those things like here's a SQLite C function that is a public function exposed in their public API, but it's not exposed to end users in Ruby through the driver. So let me learn enough about C and about the SQLite C API and the Ruby C API to just bind those two things together. Again, this is a very common theme of the work I do. Smart people do really complicated work on two problems, and then I just come along and tie a little bow between them. And
Feel that, yeah. And then we get all
benefits.
the credit, and it's awesome.
Yeah, and then I tweet about it more. So
there's actually a lesson in there. So this is really interesting to me that a lot of it sounds like a lot of this SQLite Ruby gem is building either bridges or bindings or whatever from SQLite C into user-defined Ruby, which is really fascinating to me because one of the things that I have always felt with the SQLite C API is it's beyond me. I know that that's not objectively true, but I have felt that way because I don't know any C. I don't really have a desire to know any C. I think should I encounter a situation like you did where I needed to do that, that would be enough to push me to be like, I'm trying to solve a problem. So along the way, I will learn something. But I've never had to do that. And so it feels really inaccessible to me. But this whole like, let's build a lightweight bridge binder thing to get over back to the language that is more accessible to me. That's really cool because I think in your blog post about the new Backoff that you wrote, it was all Ruby, and I was like, I don't understand how this is working. How do we get from here to there? But now it all makes sense. This is very cool.
Yeah. So it's amazing that there are these great people in open source. I mean, so the PHP SQLite driver is doing the same thing. And across all the different languages, JavaScript and Python and Ruby, there are people, somebody or groups of people have gone in and like written low-level systems code that, where you have to really master SQLite and you have to really master the programming language you're binding into. And yeah, I mean, without that work across all of the different programming languages that have drivers for SQLite, it would definitely not be the most widely used database in the world. But yeah, once you start to understand what's going on, and it gets demystified a little bit. Like I wonder if I could do that, and then like I would really like to be able to get that information out of SQLite. I futz around a little bit. At this point, AI had come around, so I definitely used the aid of AI a bit. Like, okay, tell me, here's a line of C. What is this? Why are there all these asterisks? Like, what's happening?
Yeah, what the hell does any of this
it's
mean?
A pointer. What is a pointer? So I had a lot of great
What is a
conversations
pointer?
with
Tell
AI.
me more about that. Yeah. So what was your one thing that you did differently was you used a Ruby-friendly sleep. Did you do anything differently in this busy handler? Did you change the Backoff algorithm?
Yeah. So this was the other big change. And honestly, at some point, I'm interested if there is some archaeology around like where this came from. But the SQLite's implementation, where you have a backoff. So at first, you're going to wait 1 millisecond. And if you can't write, you'll sleep for 2 milliseconds and you check again. And if you can't, you'll wait 5 milliseconds and you'll check again. I don't know where it came from, but in the context of multi-threaded applications, like when you have multiple connections open to the database, it kills long-tail performance because it penalizes old queries. And if you have a lot of contention, so if you have traffic, then you are going to get old queries. So what that means is that, so you think about, let's just say it's 1, 2, and 5 milliseconds. So on the third retry, this query is going to wait 5 milliseconds. And the thing that really unlocked me understanding what was going on was recognizing that when I think about backoff queues, for me, the mental model that comes to my mind, because I know it, is background jobs. And in the world of background jobs, the semantics are subtly different. Because when you say wait 1 second, what you're saying is wait 1 second and then execute. And you have a guarantee, effectively, that it will execute in 1 second. So you're just saying just wait to run this amount of time. In SQLite, what's happening is that you're saying check back in 1 millisecond. And maybe at that point you'll be able to execute, or maybe not. And in that kind of context, if you have a lot of contention, as soon as you have a query, have to retry 3 times. On that third retry, it's going to wait for 5 milliseconds. And that means if new queries are coming in and they're only waiting 1 and then 2 milliseconds, every new query will be able to try twice before this query can try again once. And it just gets worse and worse and worse. And so once you get into the 5th or greater retry for any particular query, the odds of it going to 20 retries go way up. And once you're at 20, the odds of it going to 100 retries go way up. And so under contention, you will always have some queries that go all the way to the end, that never execute.
Because all the new guys are sneaking
because all
in
the
front
new
of
guys,
them.
keep sneaking to the front of the line. Exactly. And so for multi-threaded contexts, it is really important that you don't use the busy timeout. And the busy timeout is just SQLite's own default implementation of a busy handler. It's using the same API. It's just like, here's a busy handler that we've built ourselves. But if you are in a context where you're going to have multiple connections open to SQLite, which is going to be the default for most web applications today, I strongly believe that you just can't use the busy timeout. You have to define your own busy handler, and you have to simply retry the same. So the way we implemented it is that every query, every retry just waits 1 millisecond and checks back in. And after doing various benchmarks, what we found was that, like, the worry obviously is CPU thrashing, right? Like, you're just checking in a lot, and is that going to create other problems, like create pressure on the rest of the system? And in our benchmarks and testing, the answer was no. Of course, always, right? Like, write your own benchmarks, test things out. Could be different in different contexts with different programming languages, who knows what. But in general, that philosophy of don't actually back off. Just give every query, every retry the exact same chances of getting the right lock and actually executing. And that will, like, I have these graphs in the blog post of like the P99 or P9999 latency when you go from like 4 concurrent web requests to 8 to 16 to 32, and they're just stair stepping, and you get some, you know, your P99 will be 5 seconds, and you just change that, boom, it immediately flattens out, and you'll get like your P49s will be like 500 milliseconds as opposed to like 15 seconds. That was honestly like the jump for when you have like 64 concurrent web requests you're throwing through a benchmark. So that's a massive
How did it
change.
feel when you cracked that? Like when you first typed in 1, 1, 1, 1 instead of 1, 2, 5, 15, 20. How did it feel when you ran that benchmark?
Yeah, ecstatic. I won't lie. Especially for that one, because it was such a deep rabbit hole of like, what is happening here? Like it took a long time to really investigate like all the different layers and then like the for that particular point is like, I thought I had figured it all out. Just the change to be like, don't do C level backoffs, do Ruby level backoffs. And then, and I do the initial benchmarks and everything looks good. And I just noticed like, it's like, that's a little bit of a stair step. I'm just looking at P99s and like around 32, it's like a little bit like, I wonder. And I just look at the benchmarking tool I have also has 49, so P99.99. And I just look at that and I put it in a graph and it's like, whoop, which is the exact same shape that my P99s had that I was trying to solve. And I'm like, what is going on? And then, so it's like, I thought I was done. I thought I had cracked the nut on this like really complicated problem. Then I immediately see this other problem. And once I cracked that, I'm like, oh, okay, everything is coming together. And I have like, every chart I have is completely flat. That's when I knew like, okay, it completely changes your experience working with SQLite in Rails applications. Like before these changes, it was bad. It just was. Yes. I've given some conference talks and I have this big slide and I say, it is not viable out of the box. Like, don't do it. It won't go well. You're going to be angry. You'll have problems. It's not worth it. And in the new release of Rails, all of these fixes will be in there by default. And so starting in the fall, and a lot of them are already there, and that we have a release candidate out for Rails 7.2 right now, and a lot of these fixes will be in there. Not all of them, but a lot of them. We're finally getting to a place where the out-of-the-box experience actually is production ready, and that was one of like 2 major pieces to get it done. And so when I finally cracked like that final lever, it's like, oh, this is a great relief.
Yeah, that's amazing. I am well acquainted with the idea of cracking a really hard problem and then realizing that there are more problems underneath. And sometimes being able to crack those, but it sounds like you got to the very bottom of it, and that is very impressive, and you should be proud of yourself. And I'm glad that you have been writing about it, because this is incredibly interesting. Like this is interesting work. And I have as I've mentioned, thoroughly enjoyed reading about it. So it sounds like some have already landed in 7.2. The fullness of the fixes will land in 8. Do y'all do major version?
Yep.
Okay, so it'll land in 8, and that sounds like you said that's coming this fall. So what is, as we wrap up here, what is like what does your future hold? I think you've given a few talks on SQLite and Rails. So it sounds like you are you're firmly in the, I don't know if it's the content game or whatever, but you're out there and people know you as this guy. So what is your future? What do you want it to be? What do you see yourself doing in the next couple of years? And where should people follow along?
Yeah. So I have found that really my core driver, for whatever reason, and I honestly don't even know all of the reasons, but I really feel passionate about making the default vanilla out of the box experience for Rails developers who want to embrace this philosophy of going all in on simplicity, like trying to compress as much complexity as possible to make that experience seamless and easy. And there is still some work to be done there. So this whole problem and fix that we're talking about, this pull request is still open. So that won't even be in 7.2. That's like coming for 8. The other big problem, which we don't have the time to talk about much, but is around the difference between deferred transactions and immediate transactions. Mm-hmm. You're also going to get database locked errors by default using deferred transactions in a multi-threaded environment because the way that SQLite acquires the write lock and where it tries to do it, like you just need to use immediate transactions. If you want to learn more, blog posts are on my site. I go very deep into it, but that pull request has been merged. I'm not 100% certain if it's in the release candidate yet for 7.2. Might just be in 8. So there's still work to be done there. And then there's also work to be done on the deployment story. So Heroku has been the big force in deploying Rails applications for about a decade now. And you just can't use SQLite on Heroku, right? They have an ephemeral file system and it's just not going to work. Don't even try it. There's not workarounds. Don't waste your time trying to find workarounds. It just doesn't work. Don't use it. So the alternative is you get a VPS and you get it set up and you manage it yourself. And that's like, I'm a sicko and I happen to kind of enjoy that experience and like learning those things and improving my skills in those areas. But I recognize that for a lot of people, like that's a lower value use of their time to like become system administrators. Mm-hmm. So I believe that the simplicity of this stack allows for a simplicity in deployment. And so some of my current work that I'll be writing more about in the coming weeks is around like, okay, what does it take to get one of these hosting providers, just like a bare metal VPS, to get it set up to run a Rails application where you've just gone all in on SQLite and you can do everything on one machine and you don't have to have 18 different services installed and properly running and properly configured to work with each other. And then at like the longer lens, and part of me is thinking right now, like I shouldn't even say this because I'll probably never solve this problem, but I will be honest about like, I have honestly dreamt about this problem multiple times. And
that's a heck of a buildup. You got to tell us now.
At some point, somebody, maybe me, but like the world would be an amazing place if somebody cracked the nut of solid, non-blocking, zero downtime migrations in SQLite. This is a major problem. I love a lot of things about SQLite, but if you have a really big database and you go to add an index, there's nothing you're going to need to put up a banner and say, hey guys, let's just bring the system down from 3 a.m. to 4 a.m. on Tuesday. That's going to be your safest bet for sure. And I really am deeply jealous of all of the other databases and the infrastructure of open source tools that have sprung up around them with all the different ways to do zero downtime migrations of various kinds. And I can't help, it's like everything is possible, right? Like these are just, we're talking over rocks with electricity in them. Like everything is possible. Of course it's possible. It's just hard. So I would love to crack
so
that
enticing.
nut. It does. And I've thought about it and I've got some wild ideas. So that's like my white whale. And if I ever solve that problem, like I can't even begin to guess what that elation will feel like. In terms of following along, I am fractaled mind everywhere. I was actually thinking earlier that I think that is connected to my obsession with simplicity. We can have that conversation later. But so my blog is fractaledmind.github.io. I'm Fractaled Mind on GitHub. I'm Fractaled Mind on Twitter. I'm Fractaled Mind on YouTube. I have a few video series I've done there. And I really do, I make sure to say this at the end of any of these podcasts or interviews I have. I benefited massively from people active in the community who were willing to give me some of their time and some of their attention and help me out and talk with me. And I'm fully aware of how necessary that was for my advancement and progression in my career and just learning about things and feeling excited and happy about what I'm doing with my life. And I absolutely want to pay that forward. So I really do have an open door policy. Reach out. Like if you have problems, if you have things you're interested in, like I have this crazy idea. I wonder if we could use SQLite for this. Reach out. I'm happy to chat. Hop on a Google Meet, hop on a Tuple, whatever. I really sincerely mean that. And it's kind of a moral obligation for me. I have to pay off all of these debts. So you'd be doing me a favor as well.
Well, Stephen, this has been a delight. You're fascinating, but beyond SQLite, you're a fascinating guy, and I really enjoyed finally getting to talk to you, in real life over the internet. But this has been delightful. So if y'all want to find more of Stephen, I highly encourage you follow him on Twitter and go and read all his past blog posts. Even if you're not a Ruby person, I'm not a Ruby person, and I learned a ton about SQLite through just reading the stuff he's written. So thank you for doing this. Thank you for what you're doing for your community. And if y'all want to talk to him, please reach out. It sounds like he's got a lot of debts to pay off. So you'd be doing him a favor. So please reach out to Stephen. And Stephen, thank you for doing this with me.
Yes, thank you.